Wow, we really are from all over the world here. Hi, Tania. It's so great to see you, to have you here.
Hi, Tal. It's such a pleasure.
And so here is what we're going to do today. So Tania, I will start by introducing you, and then I'll say a few words about cultures in and the relationship to happiness. And then from there, what we'll do is have a conversation and then take questions from our audience. Very excited to learn. You know, my top strength is the love of learning. So I'm in my element.
Totally agree. It will be fun.
Good. So Tania is originally from South Asia. Her grandparents were born in India. Her family resides in Pakistan, which is where she spent her schooling and undergraduate years in Karachi. She then moved to Boston, which is where we met, studied international relations and positive psychology. Then an internship in media and television led to Tania working in the industry for some years. And then she left corporate America and turned to the healing arts through yoga and meditation. Moreover, she's been a student of Sufism for the past decade. Now, having spent the first half of her life in South Asia and the second half in the West, she has gained an understanding of what these very different and culturally rich parts of the world can teach us. And she's going to share with us some of her insights. So before we hear those insights, I thought I would frame some of the some of my thoughts on culture and where it resides in the realm of happiness. You know, as part of the Happiness Studies Academy, we talk about happiness as existing on three levels. So first of all, there is the universal level. The universal level is something that is not unique to any person or any culture. These are things that are common to everyone and everywhere. For example, wherever you are and whenever you are, meaning today or in the past, as well as in the future, people search for a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Wherever you are and whenever you are, we all need relationships. Physical exercise or movement is important for all of us universally, regardless of where we're from or what era we were born in. So these are the universals aspects of happiness. Then there is the cultural, and the cultural, it matters whether you were, you know, born, raised in Pakistan or India or the US or Israel or Kenya. And there are very different cultural expectations, and these of course matter, and they matter a great deal. And then there is the personal. So we have the universal, we have the cultural, and we have the personal. And the personal is where we're all different. So two people who were born and raised in the same building in Karachi have different needs and wants in terms of what for them provides happiness, what for them is meaningful. One may find it in the media, the other may find it in yoga, the other may find it in raising a family, or all of the above. So the individual differences matter as well. Now, interestingly, for the universal and the cultural, what do we need to identify is research. And there is research on it, and there is research on the importance of meaning as a universal. There is research on the need for movement and exercise as a universal. There's also cross-cultural research. When we look at how the need for meaning is different in, say, China and Germany, and where they find what is meaningful for them, that there are cultural differences. We have research for that. But what about the individual? When it comes to the individual, we have me search. So it's research for the universal, it's research for the cultural, it's me search for the individual. Where do I find a sense of meaning and purpose? What kind of exercise would provide me with the most with the most happiness? These are individual differences. So in today's research world, there's a lot of me search, there's a lot of introspection, there's a lot of universal research, but there isn't that much cross-cultural research. And this is where we turn to you, because I think the people who are best equipped to talk about cultures, whether their own or others, are ones who can contrast their experiences. We've had meaningful and deep experiences in at least two very different and rich cultures. So Tania, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Tal. I think this is such an incredible inquiry, especially since we've gone through a very interesting year and it's still not quite over. And a lot of us have had time and space to be reflective and introspective. Of course, a lot of things that we draw about happiness originally do come from the things that we have learned in childhood from our cultures. And every culture has, we've all partaken from wherever we've come from in the world. Now, I can speak about having been born and growing up in South Asia, being raised in South Asia with those cultural edicts and principles and ways of being. I do understand, first off, is that happiness is very relative. It's, giving food to a hungry person would make that person happy. That would be a moment of happiness for them. Or a prisoner being released from their prison and breathing fresh air would be very happy. So of course, happiness is, or a beloved meeting someone whom they've been separated from for a long time would be extremely happy at the sight of the beloved. So of course, happiness is extremely relative, but in certain parts of the world, and I think in places that are developing countries, places like South Asia, places like even East Asia, even parts of Middle East, for instance, I think there are different, there are also different lenses from which we can see happiness. First and foremost, I think it's the socioeconomic structure, which is extremely important. In developing countries, and having grown up in one, sometimes simple things as waking up in the morning and knowing that the electricity is working and then there's running water in the taps before going to school at 6 a.m. in the morning, and it's cold and you want to make sure there's hot water so you can wash your face and take a shower, gives you immense joy. The fact that simple things work, the fact that roads are not broken, the fact that school is open, the fact that there are no curfews, the fact that we're not being invaded or our neighboring countries are not being invaded and whatnot. So there's the infrastructural socioeconomic reasons which can affect one's mood and one's ability to feel happy or unhappy. The second layer that I find in several cultures of the East is that I like to say that we like to move like a single cell organism. So a single cell organism. For instance, we don't think of ourselves as individuals. We're not raised to think of ourselves as individuals. We grow up in still to present day. We grow up in a very tribal fashion. We grow up in a very collectivistic. The sense of community dominates pretty much the idea of happiness as well. So like I've lived in the West for half my life now, and I have found that in the West, happiness can be rather individualistic. We set goals and we achieve goals, and achieving those goals fills us with a great deal of happiness. And achievement and happiness, I felt, sort of tend to be like two peas in a pod in the Western world. Meanwhile, having grown up in Asia, happiness is more, it's a societal experience. If you're well and your mother's well and your siblings are doing well and there's food on the table and the kids are getting into good colleges, there is reason to be, it's a communal sense of happiness. there is that. And then there's another layer in these parts of the world, which is very much the spiritual definition of what happiness is. And that's a whole other, that's a pretty vast landscape to cover as well, because they, in essence, the spiritual belief is that ultimately, and this is not just South Asia, this is not just, say, the Hindu or the Muslim culture, or it's even the Chinese and the Japanese culture, where they believe that your happiness is hinged to the greater happiness. Your happiness is dependent to believing in something greater than yourself, and releasing some of the burden of responsibility, in a sense, or trusting that there is something bigger that you can sort of, there's a coat rack, you can hang your coat there and say, okay, there's only so much I can do, the rest is up to, the divine program. So these, I feel, are probably, a broader way of looking at how happiness can be defined and explored in cultures other than the Western culture.
Yeah, so I love that. I mean, this is a very clear and I've never lived in India or Pakistan. I have visited the region many times, and it makes intuitive sense. And I want to explore those three pillars that you essentially introduced. So you talked about the socioeconomic structure. You talked about not being raised to think of ourselves as individuals, more the collectivistic mindset. And the third thing you talked about is spirituality. So with your permission, if we can address each one of them, because I think there's a treasure trove in each. So let's start with socioeconomic. So are you saying that it's actually a form of disadvantage? And again, I'm not talking about, hunger and poverty to the point of struggling and suffering, but when it comes to the the privileged, the wealthy, the affluence that we see so much in the West, is that a disadvantage? Do you think that could actually hurt the prospects of happiness, misconstrued?
I think that's a very interesting point, because having lived in Pakistan for several years, even the upper class, the upper echelon of the class, of the society, is still dependent on how systems are working in the country. If there's no electricity, there's no electricity. Some people will have generators, some will not have generators that will generate electricity for a short period of time. I have certainly found that in villages in Pakistan and India, it doesn't take a whole lot for people to feel happy. And if you have conversations with the children who are maybe not even going to schools, don't have shoes to wear, or are wearing tattered clothes, if you sit down and you have a conversation with them, or 14-year-old or 13-year-old, there is much joy in their eyes. And just the fact that you would sit and you'd have, somebody would have a conversation with them or offer them a piece of candy or something. Whereas the ideas of happiness in the West, because systems are in place and basic needs and amenities are met, the happiness goals are a lot more loftier, perhaps, in comparison to places like places that are struggling, places that are still trying. So I don't know if one is at more of an advantage or not, but I do sense repeatedly every time I go back home that it doesn't take a lot to find mirth and joy in villages and in day-to-day life over there.
Okay, so now, I think that the wonderful thing about cross-cultural studies is that we can learn from from each other. What's the learning here? What's the learning for my family? We're living in the US. We have electricity, except for the recent storm that took that away. But in general, we have electricity. We have the basics. We have a car. We have so what can we learn from other cultures?
I can't help but sort of draw from the teachings of the sages of the East, be it Lao Tzu or be it, the rishis that have sat on the Himalayas and have come up with, yogic philosophies and what have you, or the Sufi saints in places like Pakistan and India, they would say that it doesn't matter what you have. At the end of the day, being grateful and being cognizant and being aware of the simple things that are blessed, that are huge blessings. The fact that, there is running water, the fact that electricity went during the hurricane, but then it came back, and we can appreciate that. Perhaps it requires not so much a more micro level gaze at day-to-day life, but rather a more of an open, an open embrace to, well, let me also be grateful for the small things that fall into place and actually work, because there's so many parts of the world where systems don't work and where people struggle for simple things. So perhaps that is important and simple, learning and teaching, not to take for granted what we have in these.
It always amazes me. I mean, when I got into the field of positive psychology, the science of happiness, that's the first study I learned about. Emmons and McCullough, 2003, express gratitude, and as a result, you'll be happier, more optimistic, more likely to achieve your goals, more generous and kinder, and even physically healthier. And that's just by expressing gratitude. And the question is that it? Okay, so I do my gratitudes at night. Is it, maybe it's through, as we're talking, I'm thinking maybe it's through art, being exposed to the art of different cultures in different places, maybe reading, about the kite runner, or reading about, whether it's, Indian authors or British authors who live there and learn to appreciate. And, maybe that's another way of learning to appreciate what we have.
And traveling the world, seeing how humanity is struggling with certain things and what their approach is, and what we can learn from whether, and also cross-cultural, I think trade and economic development and helping and creating, economies that support each other. I mean, that could be another discussion, but, getting involved is also one way of drawing, of learning, and of teaching.
I like that, all the research on mirror neurons, on the fact that, we imitate, we absorb, we empathize. So just being around other people from other cultures, the default mode is that we learn. The default mode is that we absorb some of their perhaps innate cultural practices or approaches. Okay, so we have three. Do the gratitude exercise, travel and trade, work with, and the one I added is, maybe be introduced to their literature and art.
And I cannot help but think that this is also shedding light on the fact that if we are talking about happiness and we are curious and inquisitive about what makes people happy, what drives humanity to be happy or feel happiness in their lives, it's so important to also see the world not from the lens of us versus them all the time. And I can't help but see this as an economic and political situation as well. Unfortunately, we cannot, distinguish them, because we cannot, set them apart, because everything is tied in. And a lot of times we go to a lot of foreign countries and then we'll, feel like, oh, well, I don't know, this is kind of bizarre how they're doing these things. And, or in the past, how certain countries would be labeled barbaric and what have you. I think we need to, if we are to truly understand human evolution and human growth and human happiness and contentment, we also need to step into a space where we're not seeing them as completely separate, but just them in another part of the world experiencing different things that we can learn from, and perhaps we can teach as well. I think there needs to be a little bit of a more feminine or more a softer approach, perhaps?
You know, I was just a couple of hours ago, we had our weekly webinar, and with our Happiness Studies Academy students, and we talked about the appreciative eye. And the appreciative eye is a term taken from art, which is the eye that you, or the perspective that you take when you enter a museum. So for example, I can see a painting in in a marketplace, and it can be on the side. I won't even notice it. But if I see it hanging up in a museum, then I'll appreciate it. Why? Because in a marketplace, I don't have my appreciative eye on. And in the same in the same way, I think what you're saying is that why don't we approach other cultures with an appreciative eye, as if we're entering a museum or about to see, to appreciate a work of art, because then we'll see, the merit, and therefore the things that we can learn and through which we can grow. So I've never actually thought about the appreciative eyes applies to other cultures. I've been thinking about it for many years in the context of art.
Absolutely. And as you're saying this, it occurs to me, if you remember Anthony Bourdain's show on foods from different parts of the world and different cultures and cuisines, and how he would sit in Iran and have dinner with, like this poor family, or somewhere in Israel, or he'll go somewhere in the Middle East or Spain. And the warmth that people would share when they would let you inside, that, and then he doesn't go in as a complete stranger, he didn't go in as a complete stranger, but rather as someone with that lens of curiosity and that lens of, I'm here to savor, I'm here to experience, teach me.
Good. I love that. I love that. Great. So the second point that you talked about, the first one was the socioeconomic structure. The second is not raised to think of ourselves as individuals. Is there a learning there for us who were raised in the West with a much more individualistic culture of success and achievement and goals?
Tal, that's such an interesting, it was so interesting to reflect on this. And I have to be honest, there have been so many times in my life that I have personally struggled with this, because you move collectivistically. Every decision that's taken in a family is taken for the greater good of the family. It's never one person's priority. One person's never prioritized over another, for the most part. And sometimes, there's a lot to be learned, and there's a lot to be gained in having space and having individualism as well. There's a lot of there's a gift to that as well. And yet we're not islands, yet we are social animals. We do need our community. We do need our society to grow. And, being a single-celled organism, it's very hard sometimes. If somebody in the tribe has, ideas outside the lines, outside the box, and then I think the skill of communication comes in handy. How do you express? How do you educate the rest? How do you not make this a battle of egos, which has happened and happens a lot in tribal cultures? But instead, open communication and talk about. I do think, even to this day, in 21st century, even in my family, happiness is considered, a child's marriage is like a real cause for happiness, or a grandchild being born, which I think in most cultures is the case. Definitely in the Middle East, definitely in Israeli culture, I know very well, in East South Asian culture, these things are like highlights, and they increase the mirth and they increase the joy in a family. So I think there's a lot to glean from that. There's a lot to learn from moving collectivistically as a society. There are much benefits. You never feel alone. You never feel like you're facing the world alone. You always know. And that's probably why divorce levels are not as high in the East as they are in the West, depression levels are not as high, perhaps. And this is a generalization, but compared to what we hear just in news media, if someone is low or depressed, or there's been a death in the family, the culture calls for everybody gathering together for 40 days or X amount of days, and neighbors bringing in food every single day until the family is up on their feet again. So you never really feel alone in grief, which is when people, when they are alone, they feel suicidal, or they feel like, I think feeling completely alone in the world is very damaging to the soul as well. Whereas I think there's a gift.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. I think this is a really a pandemic, beyond now the pandemic of COVID. We have the pandemic of loneliness that we're seeing so much of, especially in the West. And the question is, so what do we do? What's the vaccine? What do we do about it? And if I look at the collectivistic cultures that I visited, and again, whether it's I did spend a fair amount of time in India, I spend a lot of time in Latin America, which is another and of course, having been born and raised in Israel, which I guess is somewhere, as its name suggests, the Middle East. It's somewhere in the middle. I think the main thing is that family gatherings or group gatherings in general are ritualized. And it's not just, twice a year on Christmas and Thanksgiving. It's every, Friday night or Saturday or Sunday, or it's for, 40 days when you get together and, to break the fast, or there are rituals that go way beyond the, twice a year, let's be a family. It's the day-to-day fabric. And the question is, how do we create such rituals even when they're not part of our culture? Because I think it's essential. I mean, you look at depression rates, as you point out, are they're a lot higher now than they were 18 months ago, pre-COVID, but even before that, they were extremely high. In the West, more so than in the East. In individualistic cultures, much more than in collectivistic cultures. Number one predictor of happiness, relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I
remember do that.
I remember growing up in Pakistan, the therapist used to be either the grandmother who used to live with you, or there used to be like some elderly, wise crone like woman in the family somewhere whom you could just go to and rest your head on her lap and say, this is how my heart is broken. Like, for instance, in a lot of these cultures, we don't say, when we meet someone, we don't say, how are you? The translation is, what's the state of your heart? In Farsi, for instance, they don't say, how are you? But they meet you for the first time and they say, what's the state of your heart?
Oh, wow.
Isn't that beautiful?
I love that.
Isn't that?
I love that.
It's like, you're safe. The message is always, you're safe. We're part of a community. You can be vulnerable here. It's okay. Yeah. Which is what's really lacking, which is why we feel so alone in the world, because we feel like we're always up against everybody. There is no sense of vulnerability.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm going to actually appropriate that, cultural appropriation, use that. What is the state of your heart? I must just, before we move on to the third one, and then afterwards we'll open it up for questions. So if you have questions, please put your hand up. You just click on the yellow hand below, and we'll hopefully get to as many of you as we can. But before we go to the third one, you mentioned about the grandmother being the therapist, or the elderly woman being and that brings me to a very important point, because the perception of aging is very different in those cultures. And I know, from I I played professional squash growing up, and the best players in the world then were from Pakistan. And I used to spend a lot of time in their homes. And you know, when I walked in, the respect for their parents and the grandparents who often lived with them, you know, and this was London, you know, we were not in Karachi, was you know, heartwarming. So say more about that.
I mean, I also feel like it can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because sometimes it depends on who there's always an elder in the family, be it India or Pakistan, or even I think in Japan and Japanese culture, or in other East Asian cultures, there's an elder that's really revered in the family, because the years that they have logged, you know, have given them obviously a lot more experience. They, as a result, know a lot more, and they're well versed in human emotions and the human dynamics of how families interacting, and, you know, they observe, so they're aware of personalities, you know, because they've seen, because I grew up with my grandmother in the house. So she saw me from day one, and she saw what my personality was, as opposed to my siblings. So this is definitely something that is cultural, religious. It's so deep in the DNA. It's so deep in the programming that the elder cannot be questioned. The elder has to be respected. You can challenge, you can ask questions, but there's a limit to how you ask and how you interact. For the most part, what you're seeking is always the blessing of the elder.
It's nice.
Yeah, that's always the approach. But this is also something that just is in the scripture, in the texts, and it's just so much in the jargon culturally when you're growing up that you just don't know anything else. But I will confess that I think sometimes it's at the detriment of an individual's personal growth, because a lot of times, you know, if you don't have the blessing of an elder, then you can't, you know, embark on a certain project or something, because but then you just have to perhaps trust. And that is another thing that is deeply ingrained, and that actually is like a natural segue into the third aspect of happiness, or what, you know, how it is different in certain cultures, because the element of, there's so much you can do in life. You can make goals, you can go to a good school, you have to study hard. Certain things are just universal. To get somewhere in life, we have to put the work in. But then the attitude in places like growing up in the East is a lot, there's a lot of, well, you did your best, the rest is up to God. Try your best, the rest is up. Whereas, you know, I've lived now 20 plus years in the US, and I really see people struggle. And, you know, I'm working as a yoga and meditation teacher myself, and sometimes listening to people when I teach meditation, people tap into their trauma and talk about difficulties that they've gone through. This element of, well, I can't control my life, and I can't control all aspects of my life. And there's so much that's slipping, it's driving me crazy. And I can't help but think that this need to control every aspect of our lives really comes from a place of fear. It's fear-based. It's this inability that we have, that we are trained in our schooling system here in the West, that every outcome, all your ducks should be lined up, and the outcome should be exactly what you know, want it to be, what you expected it to be.
That everything is up to you.
And everything is up to you, which is why I think there's so much depression. Which is why I think the level of competition is toxic sometimes.
Yeah. You know, the sense I'm getting is that, you know, the cultures represent archetypes, and sometimes they're opposites, not always, but sometimes they're opposites, you know, the individual and the collective. You know, it's you know, it's all up to you, and it's, you know, it's up to the, you know, the divine. You know, poverty and wealth. And I think the challenge is to find, I don't know if it's the middle path, but a synthesis of the two. So yes, of course, you know, you want to, you know, work hard and be able to sustain livelihood, goes without saying. And at the same time, learn to appreciate what you have. Yes, of course, not of course, but the, you know, individual, maybe success and ambition, you know, matters to many people. And at the same time, don't forget that no person is an island, that we need the community as well, and ritualize those together times. And finally, when it comes to spirituality, the third element that you pointed out, yes, it's important to think that you have some control, but realize that you don't have all control. And the AA creed that suggests that we need to know what we can control, what we cannot control, and to have the wisdom to know the difference. I think that's also a synthesis, perhaps, between the culture and where the two can learn from one another, from each other.
Absolutely, because so many times, I mean, we've lived enough to know that so many times you take all the right steps, you take all the correct measures on paper that are meant to be taken to achieve a certain outcome, be it a project you're working towards or a job you're vying for. And you've got the degree, you've got the qualification, and you show up and yet something doesn't click. And it happens over and over again in life. We're all familiar with this, where you show up prepared, but something didn't click, and somehow you lost the opportunity, or the opportunity wasn't meant to be yours. How does one explain that to oneself when one has no connection to a certain belief system or a structure of thought that doesn't inundate you all the time with the responsibility, but that you can step back and say, okay, well, I gave it my best shot. Exactly. And maybe I just have to gracefully step back and say, this is not meant to be for me right now. Perhaps there's another time for it. Perhaps it's just not on the cards. Yeah. And then be graceful about it and accept it, and turn direction elsewhere, as opposed to keep struggling and wasting years and time and energy towards a goal that's not to be had.
Yeah, I like that, with grace. Let's hear some questions. So we have Sobia, am I pronouncing this correctly?
Oh, yes, you did well. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. You feel free to turn on your camera, though you don't have to.
Oh, sorry. So I wanted to ask, I appreciate the talk. So I'm also born in Karachi, raised in the US, and living here and raising my family. And that's a question, of happiness. Of course, it's very relative, but it also has to do with how well you're able to reconcile yourself with your environment, and every step of the way that fluctuates, of course. So, but I do have a question for both of you. How would you define contentment versus happiness? How do you find that realm, because a lot of times you might get them confused. And if you're raising yourself to, a level of happiness, are you, settling? Are you not, are you attaining everything? So the question about contentment versus happiness is where, I would raise the question to you both, and I would appreciate your insight. Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, Tania, if you don't mind going first, and here is why, because I've been asked this question many times, and I actually thought that, hoping that you would talk about that, because I never felt very comfortable with my answer. So I'm glad you brought up this question, Sobia.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm thankful to Sobia for bringing this question up as well, because this is a very important piece, and part of that collectivistic, upbringing has to. And I recall distinctly times when, I would be having a personal moment and laughing about something, and my mother would actually shun me and say, there's no reason to be so happy, temper your happiness. And then I found later that as I had Chinese students, other East Asian students, that this is not just a South Asian thing. It's very much an Asian thing to believe that if you laugh too hard, it's most likely going to be followed by sadness of equal measure. So keep things very temperate and keep things very balanced. And that kind of leads you to start thinking about, well, should I be pursuing happiness? Because, the pursuit of happiness is so many things. It's health, it's wealth, it's sensual pleasure. Or should I be pursuing, or should I just be more focused on a sense of contentment with what I have, which is how we started our conversation, such as, how to someone in the West? How can they learn from someone in the East who is dealing with a broken infrastructure? And we say, well, gratitude is a very important piece in this. And I think gratitude and contentment go hand in hand, because instead of having these great big ideas and goals to achieve, which are healthy and normal and necessary for all of us, because we must have purpose. At the same time, knowing that what we have is a good place to start with as well. Where we are at is somewhere to be content about as well. And this also takes me to a lot of the Sufi teaching, because Sufis will tell you that if you're going to hinge your happiness on worldly pleasure, then you're most likely going to be disappointed more often than not. Because, if your happiness is dependent on an event or a person or things falling into place, then those things are cyclical. That's never a constant state. Whereas being content with whatever life is offering you, whatever it's showing you, wherever it's taking you, and use the lens that I'm learning, I'm in the process of learning through these events and experiences, even if there are difficulties, even if there's some kind of trauma, which is what Carl Jung talks about, right? He says the wounding is numinous. The wounding is where we actually start to wake up and start to, come into more of a personally evolved state. So resigning, not so much resigning, but looking at the world from a perspective of, well, being grateful and being content with what one has, as opposed to focusing on happiness, which is what the Sufis would say. Being content is more important than being happy, counting one's blessings. So there's the element of gratitude in this.
You're talking about acceptance, and I remember when I read Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, and I remember the visceral reaction that I had when he used the word surrender. And I read it years ago, and over the years, this word surrender, I've had a very special relationship with it, because initially I really couldn't handle it. And I said, what, resign? What, I want to do more, better, faster, higher, stronger, the Olympic motto. And suddenly surrender. And I've learned to appreciate it much more. And I think that's closer, as you point out, to the idea of contentment, accepting what is, and learning to appreciate what is. That is the connection you made to gratitude, because even the wound can and does teach us. When we I think of Khalil Gibran's writing in The Prophet, and how he talks about how each difficult experience actually helps us grow and increases our capacity for experiencing both pain, sorrow, as well as joy.
I agree. I would also just like to say, perhaps it's not so much of an absolutist worldview either. I think it is more, it's innate in us. We're programmed to strive, to want more, to yearn, to long, to ache. We're pre-programmed as human beings. We have to be engaged in life. We have to serve. The greatest, the highest, the noblest thing we can do in any tradition, in any part of the world, is to be able to serve humanity, or serve by taking care of our own evolution and whatever gifts we can bring forth. So I think that is a very integral part of being human. But at the same time, being content and giving it your best shot, whatever it is that you're doing, whatever it is that your endeavors are, and whatever you're creating in your life. But that, woven in with that sense of contentment that I'm going to give it my best shot, and I'm also going to be grateful. Every moment, every step that I take, everything that I achieve, and the things that slip away through my fingers, I'm going to be grateful for that. I learned something from it. And perhaps it has to be it has to be that wedded bliss. Perhaps these things have to be woven and they cannot be seen as separate.
Yeah.
That's what's coming to me.
Love it. Thank you. Moshin, can you unmute yourself, please? Feel free to turn on your camera. You don't have to.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you. Thank you so much. So Tania and I have something in common, which is, we're both from Pakistan, in Karachi. So it's thank you for this fascinating conversation and discussion. And I don't really have a question, but perhaps an observation. And I completely agree with Tania, having been exposed to that culture and a pretty traditional sort of more social mores and everything. I think there is a lot to be said about the communal aspect, which I think is really important to be able to, at the family structure and being able to, in grief and happiness, to be able to, spend time together. I think it makes a huge difference. However, I think on the other side of it, and I think Tania did allude to it, which has to do with it could be self-limiting. And I guess one could look at being able to grow oneself in an environment where, for example, in South Asia, in some parts of the world, and I don't want to single out Pakistan necessarily, where, it's not really conducive to self-growth or self-development. I can tell you from example that, one could, I think there's ways to be able to achieve happiness because that's what you want to do. If you have a passion for something, you could actually do something about it. And I think the environment here is conducive to that. The social environment, you could go back to school. You could have a second act in your life and actually excel at it. So just an observation that I think there's two aspects to everything. And I just wanted to sort of throw that in. And I don't know if you or Tania would have any observations, any thoughts on that.
I fully agree. I'm just going to jump in, Tal. I fully agree. And, having been born and raised in that culture, I see lots of glorious benefits and lots of teachings that, I'm passing on to my daughter. And I feel like we have a very cohesive and open and tight relationship.
Sure.
And we give this sense of support to each other. But at the same time, even in these Eastern cultures where these things, like the elder is always revered. And sometimes, like I said, that is a double-edged sword. Sometimes you have new ideas. The younger generation has new ideas that the older generation hasn't quite caught up with, and so they can feel restrictive. And I think we really do need to learn from the West. And perhaps there needs to be a confluence. There needs to be more of there actually needs to be more of a learning from the West and vice versa.
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
think we can reach that level of wholeness or, growth if we don't open our minds and our hearts to what we can learn from each other. So I agree.
Absolutely.
It's not all glorious. There's a lot to learn about individualistic.
It works both ways. Absolutely. Yep.
Nice. And I think, this goes back to your point, Tanya, of the importance of travel. Because when you travel, you do get exposed and you do see things through a different lens. I think back to my studies and reading the book Democracy in America by de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville came from France and studied the Americans, and it's probably he studied the North Americans. It's probably the greatest book written about North America because he was from the outside, because he had that different perspective. Because he wasn't the fish in water; he was the person who was outside the the fish tank, and he got a lot that he applied to his life and learned from the North Americans. Just as North Americans are going to be it France or Karachi or New Zealand can learn a great deal from these cultures. So it's the cross-cultural fertilization that's valuable.
Oh, it's
Absolutely.
huge. Absolutely, it's huge. And I think in America, people can learn from that because, people tend to be insular, unfortunately. And I mean, there's folks, you meet up and they haven't really gone from one state to the other all their lives. And, it's kind of sad, but it's very instructive to be able to travel and to be able to meet with people. And like you said, cross fertilization, I think is huge. Makes a huge difference.
And Mohsin, sorry, but I really have to make a plug here for reading the great books
Yes.
of the different cultures. So, if we can travel, there's nothing like a firsthand experience. But in addition to, if we can also read, the great books, whether it's read Rumi or whether it's read, Patanjali, or whether it's reading
Khalil Gibran.
Khalil Gibran, exactly. So, it's invaluable. And vice versa, as you said,
Sure.
Reading Aristotle, if you're, well, obviously, if you are from the West, reading Aristotle as well, and also if you're not.
Right.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Tania, as well. Appreciate it.
So welcome.
Carla, can you unmute yourself, please?
Hello, Professor Tal Ben-Shahar. Can you hear me? Hello, Tania.
We can hear you very well.
Thank you so much for having us here in this class. I'm Brazilian, and I'm the cultural thing in my family was always the expectation of building family, that you're supposed to marry before the age of 30 to have kids and to buy your house and your car, and then this is successful. And for my mom, for many years, I was with this embate that I say, Mom, I want to study, I want to do masters, I want to do PhD, I want to become a professor. And what I really hurt me a lot was when I found a opportunity to study in the United States, a scholarship, I went here to the California, Berkeley, and I studied there for 1 year. And for my family, this was less important than my sisters that both got married at the age of 30, and they have wonderful kids that I love, my nephew and nieces. But for me, the acceptance come when I understood that I'm different from my sisters. And I still love deeply and completely love them and love my family. But now they realize that I'm different, and I choose to live in the United States. I choose to be in a simple life and have a simple pattern of life instead of having material things. And my question to you, Professor Tal and Professor Tania, is how do I identify this repetitive behavior to seek for expectation, to seek for fulfill of my expectations and have more acceptance of others that they are different from me, and they are not in my body, in my mind, and still love and accept myself as I love and accept others. I don't know if you understood. Sorry if I talk too much. Thank you. How can I identify this behavior that I'm having maybe with friends or with colleagues in future work, and how can I stop trying to pleasant them or to achieve the high level of expectation, because we cannot achieve all the level of expectations, and also be more self-compassion with myself and acknowledge myself for my own goals and my own things that I choose in my life in this path to become adult and have more than 35 years old. And my things that are not important for the Brazilian pattern of successful in culture, since I don't have $1 million apartment or house or a fancy car, but I'm still happy and completely happy with my life and my small group of friends and what I do. How can I change this to not suffer a lot especially when it comes from my mom, the person that I more love? When she got COVID, I felt super depressed that I was not there, and actually I couldn't do what I like to have her acceptance. That I would love to have her acceptance and say, my daughter, I'm proud of you. But I know that she is not able to give me this acceptance. And I have to accept this for myself, that it's okay. If she's not say that I'm okay, it's okay. That she's not proud that I have a PhD or a master's and I live abroad in a simple situation instead of living in a beautiful house in Brazil. How do I do with this suffering patterns?
Yeah.
I feel so much for you, Carla. I understand exactly what you're experiencing. it's been a similar journey where there's been more criticism for the choices I have made in my life. And even after my divorce, when I chose to continue living in the United States and working and not going back home. But this is where I think we really need to come into a more blended space with our cultures. I don't think one aspect is better than another, or one culture is better than another. I think things are changing. I mean, with the advent of the internet and gadgets, even the older generation has access to a lot of the way the world is changing and the way people are thinking these days. I have no choice. My daughter at this age shares certain things with me, which sometimes I feel I'm not prepared to hear, but I have to show up and I have to be ready, because that's just the world we live in. I feel, and I can't, and Tal, maybe you will share your thoughts, but I feel it's so important for your well-being to do what you feel is essential for your growth and for your personal happiness. Because when you're happy, obviously, as a parent, I mean, I know, and as parents, we know that when our children are happy, we are, inadvertently happy as well, or rather directly, not even inadvertently. We're happy when our children are happy. We're miserable when our children are sad and unhappy. Meanwhile, these cultural concepts that have gripped, our parents' generation so tightly, where they don't see anything other than things being a certain way, and they should be. And if you didn't follow, the playbook, then you're clearly, you didn't do so well. You failed at the things that the culture prescribes or professes. But I think you are in a very critical place, Carla. And I think it's people like you that will change the direction of the wind. When you stand your ground, I mean, I think it's a huge responsibility, but it's also a really honorable place to be in, because you are the bridge that changes the direction. You stay true to what you're doing while loving and honoring your mother and not judging her, because obviously she comes from a certain mindset and it's sometimes hard for people to change. But I feel like for the child that I've had to stick to my guns and do what I thought was I'm no less a Pakistani or a South Asian because I've lived more of my life in the West. I still speak all the languages from back home. And yes, I do have a US citizenship, but still, the foods I cook are still very traditional. But I am that bridge and I choose to be that person. And it's not always easy, but you have to know that you have been given a big responsibility, and you've been chosen to up-level the future generations, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Professor Tania. It makes lots of sense for me. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'd like to add to this, and again, you can talk about this so much more deeply, Tania and Carla, since you're experiencing it firsthand, and there's no substitute for that. I want to draw on some Tibetan Buddhism teaching, which has found its way over the past few years into Western research and psychology labs, and that is the idea of pain and suffering existing on two levels. The first level of suffering is inevitable. Life, the Buddha said it, we know it, part of life is suffering. That, when there is a loss or when we disappoint someone we care about, or we don't gain the approval of someone we care about, or when, we wake up in the morning on the wrong side of the bed, whatever. That's inevitable. These things happen. This is the first level. The second level of suffering is suffering that comes when we reject the first. So when we fight and we say, no, I'm not going to feel sadness or anxiety, or I shouldn't be upset that my mom is upset, or I shouldn't be angry. When we fight this level, this anger or this sadness or this anxiety only intensifies. I see here Amanda wrote in the chat, quoting here it is, quoting Christine Neff. And Professor Christine Neff talks about self-compassion. And she says that suffering equals pain times resistance. Suffering equals pain times resistance. In other words, if there is a lot of resistance, suffering goes up. Pain is constant. Say it's a given. Yes, Carla, you care about your mother more than anyone else. And of course you are, it pains you when she's upset or not as happy as she could be if you had gone in a different direction. Accept that pain. When we resist it, it intensifies. And I think this acceptance and, contentment, as you put it, Tania, coupled with the recognition that it's your life. And ultimately, if you're happy, they'll be happy.
Thank you so much.
I think the combination of the two
Excellent.
is a 1-2 powerful process for dealing with pain, not eliminating pain. It's part of every life, but for dealing with the pain. Rish, can you unmute yourself, please?
Hi everyone. Thank you for hosting this space. This is a really insightful discussion that I stumbled upon. A friend of mine recommended it to me, and funnily enough, she didn't join herself. But I think she's the one missing out because this is fantastic. So I'd like to really congratulate you both for putting this together, and of course, working in this field. So I'm grateful to you both to add so much value and happiness to other people's lives as well. And that's great. It's a great gift you give to the world and yourselves as well. So my question is that, of course, we have different levels of happiness. The threshold of happiness is, let's say, different between the East and the West, is something what Tania touched upon, and Tal as well. But is there, like, genetically, is it different for happiness between men and women? Like, do men and women in some ways perceive happiness very differently? Is there anything there, or not? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. And this could probably even be answered from an Eastern perspective and a Western perspective. Tal, you want to go first?
No, I'm curious.
I'm curious too, but I'll explore it since Rish is asking. I do think in the East, especially, growing up in places like India and Pakistan, traditionally, we know that it's been a little harder for women, right? Men have been elevated to a certain position, and women have struggled for that. And so, yes, maybe smaller blessings appear much bigger to a woman growing up in the East, certainly in villages and the lesser developed areas of these parts of the world. I see my Western counterparts are also still fighting for equal rights on many fronts. Is the bar any lower? It is a very interesting question. Perhaps it's different. Perhaps the things that people acquire or receive happiness from, men and women, might be marginally different a little bit. But for the most part, at least growing up in the East, I felt, fathers as much as mothers were joyous at, accomplishments of children, success of children, the father doing well in a certain position at work or acquiring a certain position at work. I think it's always more global in the East, the whole family and then extended family and cousins, everybody gets very happy. But I think I think there are different things and perhaps in the East, women don't expect too much. It might have changed. But it's something I want to think about. It's something definitely to explore.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, do post any of your findings on Facebook. I'll follow you.
Yeah, I think, obviously, just as there is cross-cultural research, there is research on gender and happiness. And again, one of the things about the research, whether you're talking about gender or culture, is that we're talking averages here.
Yeah.
So, so obviously, the South Asian culture is more collectivistic than North American culture. And yet you can be sure that you will find individuals in South Asia who are much more individualistic than individuals in North America. We're talking average here. So similarly, when we talk about gender, I'm going to talk about some general findings. However, there are differences, and there are certain women who would fit much more into the the male archetype, so to speak, and men who would fit more into the female archetype. But one of the things that we do find is that women tend to be more ruminating. They tend to think more about their emotions and feelings, whereas men go through something, it happens, and they move on. Having said that, women are more likely to open up with their best friend when something happened, and men are more likely to hold it in. One interesting finding, and again, this is general gender differences, but there's research on marriage, or more generally on long-term intimate relationships, whether it's official marriage or not. And what the research question is who benefits more from a long-term intimate relationship, the man or the woman? And I'm talking about, men-women relationships here. And the answer is that on average, again, certainly doesn't apply in every relationship, but on average, men benefit more than women do from intimate long-term relationships.
Interesting.
Why? Because one of the things that happens in a relationship is, if you're together for a while, it becomes more and more intimate, you naturally tend to, in most relationships, open up more. Now, for the woman, this is nothing new, because she had opened up with her, BFF, best friend forever, when she was 10, and continuously does so throughout her life. Whereas for men, very often, almost regardless of the culture you're in, you hold it in because, you're a man, you shouldn't express emotions, you should be tough. But then suddenly you're in an intimate relationship and you do open up, and maybe even you cry for the first time in front of someone else. And that opens up important floodgates, because we know how important it is to express emotions. So men tend to benefit more because they get something new, a value added that they never had before. For so many of them, never had before. So, these are some of the gender differences. But and to go back to Tania's point, I think it's so important, just as Tania emphasized learning from different cultures, we need to learn from, different genders. Because men, women, non-binaries can all benefit from learning from the other.
Definitely. We men and women, we both have feminine and masculine energy within us. It may be up and down and different, and even in different points of life, times in our life that may fluctuate as well. So yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Luciana.
Oh, hi there. Thank you for tonight. I still haven't got my head around in terms of the paradox between living in the here and the now and being fully present, like that book you mentioned, Professor Tal, The Power of Now, versus, say, the PERMA model of happiness, and having the PERMA as a checklist almost, and having things to strive for and objectives and goals. Do you think is one or the other, or do you think it's a balance? And do you think this, if it is a balance, do you think this balance, if it's leans towards one side or the other, if that's dependent on the culture you're from?
Yes, so maybe I'll start, Tania, and then you can build on what. So, when you look at the PERMA model, which is the model by Professor Marty Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania, PERMA stands for 5 things. It's positive emotions, that's the P. Engagement is the E. R stands for positive relationships. M is the meaning. And A is accomplishments and achievements. Now, even within this model, and again, Marty Seligman, is one of the, greatest living psychologists. Even before he, I studied him in Introduction to Psychology before there was a positive psychology, back in the very early 90s. So, really great psychologist, a product of the West. And even in his model, PERMA, P-E, what does the E stand for? E stands for engagement. Engagement is, draws on the work of, some of you may be familiar, the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who talks about flow. What is flow? Flow is meditation in action, being engaged with what you're doing in the here and now. So even in his model of PERMA, yeah, he's talking about achievement. Yeah, he's talking about, success and accomplishments, and about finding a sense of meaning in what you do, in your purpose. And he's also talking about being engaged, being present.
I think it has to be a blended reality, right? And it seems like this is one of the things that's coming across so much in this conversation, that it's neither one or the other, but that, and perhaps each individual has their own particular combination that's going to work best for them.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Malina. Hi.
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 Thank you so much. I'm so excited. I'm from Mexico, and it's really an honor being with you and learning from you. I live in the south of Mexico. It's called Yucatan. It's the peacest place in my country, and you have here from my country. Still, we have the highest rates of depression and suicide in the region. We have like 1 million people in the city, and we're getting like people dying by suicide one per day.
Wow.
Now more than ever. I work promoting well-being and positive psychology. Still, I don't know how to embrace from a positive somehow point of view these topics. And mainly now that tomorrow is International Prevention Suicide Day, I don't have Tal Ben-Shahar ever in my life in an open platform, and Tania. So I will love if you can give an advice how to embrace this. Thank you.
Is there any data or research as to what are the causes for depression on a daily, suicide on a daily basis in your part?
Not really. I've been investigating, and what I have found is there's social interrelation problems like alcoholism, interfamiliar violence. The violence is inside of the houses, are not outside. And I also have found that maybe the weather is too much humidity, and it's simple things that doesn't, we don't see it in the big picture yet, but there's not the real data. We just see like peaceful city, happy people still dying. So has to be something behind, many things that we are not interconnected yet. So
this kind of reminds me of the news that was coming out of India and Pakistan when COVID was, when COVID had started last year. There was a lot of report of domestic abuse that was coming out of that part of the world, because it had to do with unemployment. It had to do with the socioeconomic conditions that people had found themselves in because of COVID. A lot of people lost their jobs or could not go back to work. And then in countries where infrastructure is already weak, and proper training is never given, or emotional growth and evolution is never really part of conversation, dinner table conversation. It really isn't in most countries anyway, I think. People would lash out on their spouses, and there were a lot of such cases that were being reported at the time. So if those are factors that are influencing this situation, I mean, I tend to think in parts of the world where these things happen, and especially, I mean, I'm coming from Pakistan, where, you know, men constantly marginalize women. It happens a lot. I mean, we're hearing about the Taliban in the next door, you know, just like we're a thin border away from them and how they treat women. One of the conversations that keeps coming up all the time is how desperately the men, in this case, the men need to be educated and need to be taught how to. It's what Tal was saying earlier about how, for whatever reason, society, Eastern or Western, doesn't really give men the space or the freedom or the tools to indulge in their emotions, to indulge in their pain, to indulge in their grief, and to encounter it and understand it and grow from it and heal it. It's not even part of conversation in so many cultures, and perhaps in Mexico as well. And honestly, I think it needs to be addressed at a grassroots level. I don't know if there is a cosmetic solution to these problems. I mean, I come from a part of the world where these are very deep problems as well. And I do think it has a lot to do with education of the men and perhaps the women as well, because the women are also, you know, silently taking all this nonsense, or, you know, taking all this violence, emotional or physical. And it really needs to be addressed at a deep place where you can't just release your frustration, you know, your socioeconomic frustration out on your spouse or your children. Alcoholicism is a direct result, drug abuse. All of these things are all so deeply tied in.
And just to build, Tania, on what you said, I think the bottom line is education. You know, so many people asking about, okay, so what can governments do to help increase levels of happiness? Because we know when we increase levels of happiness, violence goes down. We know that people become more productive, more engaged with life, better relationships, of course. So how do we increase levels of happiness? And it boils down to education, and education for all. And not just education in terms of learning how to, you know, solve, you know, mathematical, you know, problems. You know, that's important too. Education in the science of well-being, education in how do we cultivate healthier relationships, in education in how do we raise resilient children, how do we increase our own, you know, self-esteem and self-worth. I mean, these are all very important ideas that should become part and parcel of every educational system, whether we're talking, you know, in Pakistan or Mexico or Israel or Kenya or Australia. Thank you, Malena. And it sounds like that's what you're doing, educating.
Thank you so much. I'm learning from you guys. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We unfortunately have only time for one or maybe two questions, so we won't get to all of you. Apologies in advance, but let Shami, can you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, thank you, Tal. I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say thank you because I've been following you, going through your YouTube, this thing, and your books, and I have been really inspired. So I'm staying awake at 3 a.m. at night in India just to hear you. And just would like to add on to it that, yes, it is our own personal commutations and permutations and combinations that makes us healthy and happy. In my life, I have been through a lot of challenges, but yes, educating myself through, you know, people like you, through our cultural values and building upon our family, that has really helped through. So thank you very much for being my support system too.
Well, thank you. You know, Shami, if this was graded, you would have gotten a straight A for being up at 3 a.m. But it's not
well, I did my sustainable well-being thesis in Glasgow, and then I read about you, and I have always been wanting to do my PhD with you, but let's see when it happens or not.
Well, I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Elissa, can you unmute yourself?
Good afternoon, evening, morning. Thank you, Tal, Tania, and everyone. I have a question related to the third level, so the spiritual one. The cultural difference between trying to control in Western cultures and rely on spirituality and Eastern ones could be also perhaps related to the acceptance of change, because I assume that when we really understand that everything is changing and evolving naturally, it's easier to understand that we cannot control. But is there any kind of cultural difference as well between that acceptance of change? That perhaps like Western cultures tend to think that everything is static?
I mean, the Buddhist culture talks about this a great deal. They say that the default mode, in fact, of life is dukkha, dukkha meaning suffering, and suffering also related to how life will continue to change. And again, it's part of the scripture, and that, and even in, we've heard in the Western culture, we say change is the only constant in life. And again, and I'll tie it up to what Tal said earlier, that pain is so much an outcome of the resistance to what is naturally arising, what is organically arising. And I really think, I mean, the whole Newtonian, Descartesian way of looking at the world is changing. That's why we're having these conversations. I think we definitely need to take a more flexible and softer, more feminine perhaps, lens on how to approach life. And the more I study spirituality, the more I find that it really is, as the Sufi teachers say, they say there's a rose, but a rose is nothing without the scent of the rose. That's what makes it special. And spirituality is the scent of the rose. Otherwise, it could be a paper rose. It wouldn't mean much at all. So spirituality in the sense that it gives you, like Lao Tzu talks about, that there is the Tao, there is always the current of life, there's always the river that's constantly flowing. And we have to perhaps learn, and that aspect of surrendering is more learning how to just lay on your back and just let the current carry you, and trusting that wherever you will land was part of your destiny as well. That said, of course, they also say that, making effort, and not just completely leaving everything is also an important, it's imperative. We can't live completely sedentary lives, or we can't give up on our purpose and our projects. But I think change is something that, whether we like it or not, it keeps knocking on the door from time to time. And we perhaps need to create a new relationship with change, and understand that it's here to teach something, and it might be a better situation than what we've experienced in the past. Or maybe the past system is not working anymore, which is why, things are changing, which is why perhaps we need to look at things in a different way.
Thank you.
And I think there is, so Tania, I'm glad you brought up Lao Tzu, because that's the first book that came to mind, Alyssa, when you asked the question. But Lao Tzu uses the metaphor of water, whether it's we floating in the current, or we being water, which is always changing, always accommodating. And that metaphor is extremely helpful for the nature of reality, because the only constant is change, and impermanence is part of life. And again, learning to accept it rather than fight it and get rid of it is the most helpful. And that has to do with acceptance, with the ebb and flow, with the seasons, with the night following day. If we accept it, and I think there is more acceptance of that in Eastern cultures, broadly speaking, than in the West. That also manifests itself in how we look at aging. In the West, what's big? Anti-aging. I wrote an article years back called Pro-Aging, It's in, there's research by, I think her name is Rebecca Levy from Yale University, talking about how important it is for us to have positive perceptions of aging, in other words, of change, in other words, of impermanence, for our happiness, not just when we're older, also when we're young, forever young. Thank you, Elisa, for the question. Tania, we've come to the end of this conversation. And, I must say the state of my heart is a lot better than it was at the beginning. Thank you for that. It always is when we chat, when we spend time together. And let us know where can people get a hold of you? Where can they find you?
Well, I am on social media, so it's easiest to find me there, and get in touch through that. I also have a website, which is presently under construction, but I have an email address, taniakazi.com. It is always a joy to speak with you, Tal. And one of the things that my greatest takeaway from this conversation is, and I like so much the questions people asked, because it really helped me reflect on certain things that had sort of been brushed under for a while, and it was important to observe them. But one of the greatest things I feel I learned in this process also was how deeply it is essential for us to not have these hard lines and boundaries around what is East and what is West anymore. I think the world has changed. We have access. We have had access for a long time. And I will close with something that Rumi says. He says, when you think that you are separated from God, from divinity, or from any other soul, you're only in your mind. It has nothing to do with reality. There's always a merging. There's always the confluence. We're all made of the same fabric of the universe. And it just, Carla's question, all of that, it just makes me realize that we have so much to learn from each other. And for humanity to be a better, more refined version of itself, that we need to open the doors and stay with a welcoming state in the heart, and learn from each other.
Yeah. As Rumi said once more, we have to act as the guest house, bring them all in, emotions, thoughts, I guess, cultures and people.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Tania. And thank you all for spending this afternoon, night, morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you from Madrid.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much from Montana.
Good day. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much from the UK.
Thank you.
Thank you so much from Poland. Good luck in everything you're doing.
Thank you from Canada.
New York City.
Thank you so much from Paris. It was an amazing session.
Thank you from Toronto.
Nodaraba.
Thank you from New York City.
Thank you from London and China.
Thank you from Iran.
Wow.
Toda and Shukriya.
Shukriya.
Shukriya from Pakistan and Toronto.
Yeah.
Thank you for Auckland.
Dhanawad.
Thank you from Mexico City.
Thank you from Colombia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You're going to have to keep your hand that way forever.